what he's also speaking to is the soul, or the anima, or we could talk about this in different ways within the field. But I do think there is a timeless part of ourselves, a more ancient part of ourselves that is not adhering to the rules of time and space and society and capitalism and all these things, and actually does have a much larger sense of the course of our lives. It can be hard to uncover that voice. It's not there every millisecond of the day. We have to develop a relationship with it. I mean, this is a core idea of Jung's that Hillman, was very engaged with, but there's also this notion of the inner marriage, and that ultimately we're in relationship with ourselves, and not just in this passive way of like, oh yeah, I like myself, or I respect myself, all those things are good, but that there's actually a quite deep attempt to unify the opposites internally and to find a relationship between the timeless self and the time-bound self, between the ego and the soul, right? Or the big self with a capital S, and between the feminine and the masculine. Those are heteronormative ideas, but there's a sense of tension still between these values.
Satya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So to get started, can you maybe tell us what quarter life is, and why is this important for us to take seriously, both individually and collectively?
It's a great starting question. Quarter life is the first stage of adulthood. I define it as the first stage of adulthood between adolescence and midlife. So it's around 20 years or so. It's a span. We talk more popularly about the quarter life crisis, and I really try to speak about quarter life beyond the crisis when possible, so that what we're exploring is a developmental stage of existence and not just one crisis that people supposedly have. There's often a lot of crises back to back that are happening in these years as people are sorting out who they are. So I tend to talk about this stage of life as being really important to spend time in for a couple of reasons. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, because people are suffering. But the earlier we can anticipate what we want our life to look like and what we don't want our life to look like, the fewer big changes need to happen later on. The less likelihood there is for a major midlife crisis, where by that point you might be married with children in a job that you've been at for a while that you don't like. I'd like to encourage everyone to be sort of anticipating these things earlier, so they're not finding themselves trapped in a life they don't want later on. The benefit to society then is quite significant, because we're not sending people down the wrong track early on in their lives. We're not sending people into marriages, households, careers while they're raising children that don't feel satisfying. That has a cascading effect on a family. But we're also talking about the most generative, arguably the most generative time of adulthood. In the 20s and 30s, people are working extremely hard, producing creative work. Most of our athletes, of course, are in this time of life. I could go on and on. We want people to have a sense of who they are when they're in this stage of life, both creating culture and participating as citizens for those decades and the decades to come.
So what we're saying here is, if we acknowledge that this is a full developmental stage, and if we take it seriously, it can lead us to preventing problems further down the line and preventing things like a midlife crisis. It's like, what's that old saying? It's like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or whatever. It's like that's the way we're thinking here.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And it's not just, crisis, but mental health issues, trauma that's gone untreated, relational issues, addiction issues. It's the whole gamut. There's real suffering that, when not treated earlier on, we all know if you don't take care of a wound earlier on, it gets worse and worse over time. The treatment becomes harder, and treatment may be more catastrophic when we don't take care of things early on. So I'm trying to counter the notion that therapy in these years, or self-awareness in these years, and self-work is navel-gazing or narcissistic, which I think is the standard trope from dominant culture, that if you spend time attending to yourself in these years, you're somehow a narcissistic young person. It's really quite the opposite.
For sure. It seems so obvious to me that, these are the years that you're essentially choosing the trajectory of the rest of your life. So it makes sense to, take it slow and make a really informed decision here before you commit to a pathway, because we all just sort of jump into things, and then 20, 30, 40 years later, we're like, what happened? you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of jumping into things, and some of that's necessary. We have to often find work, we have to choose school programs, but I want to normalize changing course and reconsidering our paths earlier.
So is there a specific time frame we're talking, or you mentioned a 20-year period? Like, when would you say the quarter life stage ends, roughly?
Roughly, I would say it's from 20 to 40.
Okay.
So because what we think about, there's infancy, there's childhood, there's the teenage years, and most of those years have really had quite a bit of attention in developmental psychology. And then there's this kind of gap where everyone thinks about the years as being adulthood, kind of. It's really early adulthood or young adulthood or emerging adulthood or delayed adolescence. And then at some point we hit midlife. And so I'm trying to sort of carve out these years to say roughly 20 to 40. We could say it's 18 to 38, right? These years roughly are a stage of development too. And I'm calling it quarter life.
Can you tell us about your own story and your own path towards doing this work, Satya?
Sure, I can tell you a bit. Let me know if you want to fill in the details. But um, I was always an introspective person from very early and curious about the world and why the world worked the way it did and all this. When I went to college, my years in college were marked by 9/11 in the States, by the war in Iraq. And my experience in college was this privileged climb, freshman year, sophomore year, university, I suppose, for many of your listeners, right? I couldn't quite line up why I was climbing this gilded ladder to get a bachelor's degree in history. I loved it, by the way. I was loving studying. I loved what I was exploring. I was learning about the world, past and present. But I couldn't square what my degree was going to do to either make the world a better place or maintain a system that the adults prior had constructed that was leading us into catastrophic war after catastrophic war. It didn't make sense to me. And so while I was protesting the wars, multiples, and finishing my degree, I just kept having a very deep sense of existential crisis of what this was all about. And that really didn't go away. I finished with my degree and found various odd jobs. I was working really hard, but none of the jobs really made sense as to what the point of things was, And I just continued kind of pursuing that until I ultimately stumbled upon, well, actually, that's not fair to say. My mother, in my crises, sent me a couple of books that one of them was called Care of the Soul by Thomas More. And then I asked for more, and she suggested I get Jung's memoir, which is Memories, Dreams, Reflections, rather. And I devoured those books and really had a very clear sense then that there was this space in psychology that I needed to study because it was able to answer both the external questions of what was happening with society and the internal questions of what was happening in my life. The only problem was it was really anticipating people coming to this psychology in their 40s, maybe mid 30s. And I was 22 or something. So my focus then began to explore this psychology, but kind of pull it down into the younger years. And that's where it began.
It's incredible just what something like your mother recommending those books can do, like the trajectory that can put you on and how that can lead to, what you're doing now, the book that you've written, and all of the people you're impacting as well. Like it's amazing.
It is amazing. I am lucky to have had a mother who could see what I needed and could see me. and had that experience. But it is remarkable, those moments for any of our lives, that they seem from the outside very small. It's just a book in the mail, but it can have a very significant effect.
Are there any of Jung's ideas in particular you think are most helpful for helping people to navigate the quarter life stage of life?
Oh man, it's a good question. There are a lot of his concepts that are somewhat esoteric and hard to understand, and some of the easy ones I think are even themselves not terribly well understood. But he offers a great deal ultimately to help understand why modern humans are so disoriented and how disconnected we are from our souls and from nature and from our instincts. So I often have this image of like little ducklings circling around somewhere near the pond, not fully even sure what they're looking for. There's no sense of true mentorship and guidance for us to follow, to find our souls, to find our core sense of the reason that we're alive, right? So he talks about the notion of the soul simply, right, and also of a deeper self, and that alone. I mean, there's so many things that he explores. And he also, what was very critical for me, had a deep understanding of what happens in a culture that is guided by, these are not specifically words that he used that often. He used the word patriarchy and understood that we had a patriarchal society. He didn't talk about capitalism so much, though he did speak about white supremacy and what happens when a culture has kind of veered off in such a lopsided direction. So his work is also really a balancing for these social systems that expect us to fit in very, very narrow categories, and the inevitable feeling of that we're missing something when we do. So there's an enormous amount in the work that truly I just taught a class exploring memories, dreams, reflections, and once again got so much out of it. It's remarkably rich stuff that is hard to soundbite sometimes.
It's a great book. So I'm just thinking back to my own, like my early 20s after leaving university. I I was in I would jump from thing to thing quite a bit. So I left university in my final year to start my first business. And I did that for just under a year. And then I left that. And then I jumped to another business. And that was something that was totally soul destroying. It was basically sourcing products in China and selling on Amazon. And every moment I spent in that project, I just felt like I was dying a little bit inside, you know? And then it just one day I just thought I can't keep doing this. Like this is destroying me internally, you know? And I thought about the things that had most energized me in the past and the things that had really brought me to life. And it was always like creating experiences, events, and these sorts of things. So I thought, why don't I try and work in the events industry, you know? But I remember this is I remember my dad's gonna hate me for saying this if he listens to this, but I remember that evening, after I made the decision, I went to speak to him about it, and he basically he turned around and he said, "Quitting again now, quitting again." And to me, that just stung so bad, you know. And I suppose what I'm getting at here is, what would you say to someone who might be in a similar place to as I was back then, that hasn't found their thing yet and they're maybe jumping around a little bit? Would you tell them, like, is there any guidance you would give somebody in my situation then before that they do find their thing? Because for me, I eventually did find that, and I found a source of work that brings me a lot of meaning and fulfillment, and I feel very lucky for that. But it might not have ended up that way, you know. So any thoughts there?
Oh, well, it's a poignant story. Thank you for sharing it. Because everyone has a story like that, although it may not be that their father is sort of suggesting that they're failing in some way by quitting another job. For others it can be much more subtle, and for others it can be outright abusive. What you're experiencing, though, I talk in my book about the 4 pillars of growth in Quarterlife, and the first pillar I speak of as being the need to separate. And when we are in these stages of sorting out who we are or trying to sort out who we are, we're not only trying to find our souls again in societies, as you expressed, that job is soulless and soul crushing. And yet, I imagine you're looking around you and seeing, well, other people seem to do this without being as miserable as me. And now my father thinks that I'm a failure if I quit this too. He thinks that I should be fine. This is fine. Why am I not fine? There's this almost cinematic thing that so many of us go through where if you could see it in a film on the outside, you would think, run, find yourself, go after your dreams, right? But when you're living it, it's just that you think, what's wrong with me? Everyone else seems fine. So
That was the central question. What's wrong with me? That's the thing.
Yeah, it's real. And it's remarkable, so many people are going through it, but because we are not talking about it as often as we should, and because there's so much social pressure to kind of keep us in line, to keep quarter lifers in line with these systems that are incredibly broken, and that our parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles or friends inadvertently participate in trying to keep us in line. I don't think no one is saying I've signed up for this broken system and I am going to be a soldier for this broken system. But we're all raised in it in different ways, and we're all pathologizing each other in different ways and pathologizing ourselves, right? So what I hear happening for you is, and these are kind of core ideas in my book, but you were looking for a combination of stability and meaning that was valuable to you. And the bummer in a certain respect for all of us is that there is not a single script to guide us to getting there. Every single human being has to find their version of stability and meaning. And that requires quite a difficult journey. I mean, this is part of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey stuff and a lot of Carl Jung's work, but it's really an understanding that actually each of our souls are trying to find how to exist in time and space in this moment in history in a way that works for us, right? Part of the obstacle along the way is often our parents. And so we need to separate from their perceptions of us and separate from their belief systems and their value systems when they don't serve our own sense of purpose and meaning. And that can be very difficult work. I mean, I really genuinely applaud you for sorting it out for yourself, because it is not easy. And there's a reason that the midlife crisis is so often tied to parents passing away, at least historically. It was when people could finally say, oh, I'm free of my father's judgment. And I really advocate trying to do that while we can still have some relationship with our parents, if possible, while they're alive.
Let's imagine that I came to you and in the first few sessions, you identified that my parents were still having a strong influence on my thinking, behavior, internal world, etc. How would you go about starting that separation process? How would that work?
Well, probably quite carefully and slowly. I mean, I'm not terribly what's the word? I'm not a wallflower. I mean, when as a therapist, I'm often quite direct and clear. But I also know that this work of separating from parents can often be a little bit like trying to get somebody out of a cult, because no matter how much they're being harmed by these belief systems or these values, children are often holding their parents up on pedestals in different ways. And that's a survival mechanism. This is not the case for everyone, but it's very common through quarter life that people are really struggling to normalize their parents or relativize their parents or see their parents as humans, to say, yes, he does this to me and it's not good, but I love him and I see him as a person, or whatever. It's really more that it's a binary of, if I turn against him here, that means I'm not loving him. I'm not respecting him. So it's very subtle work of sort of disentangling someone's or supporting somebody to disentangle themselves from the belief systems they've been raised with and be able to start seeing the world on their own in a different way. And so it often takes quite a bit of time and a lot of wrestling, and then often a decisive move in a direction that is more aligned with one's soul and not with the old value set that they were raised in.
It's amazing how powerful this influence is on people. I think that we have some kind of cognitive bias or whatever that causes us to see our parents almost as like demigods for the first 10 years of our life or whatever. And I'm reading Martin Luther King's biography at the moment. It's a new one. It's called King by a guy called Jonathan Igue, and it's so
Beautiful.
good. It's an amazing book. But one of the things that he talks about in that book is that, like, whenever the things were happening in Montgomery and Martin's life was starting to get under threat, his dad would come to Montgomery and try and get Martin to, like, leave and come back to Alabama or Atlanta, sorry, and sort of take the safer option. And Martin was like crying and like really struggling to like make a decision after and stuff. Because even then, as a fully grown man at 28, his father still had this influence. And then I've heard people like Irvin Yalom say like he realized at the age of like 50 or 55 that everything he had done in his career until that point was trying to impress his
Exactly.
father.
Exactly. Which is, and this is the thing, to that final point, that's the classic story. That has been the story in developmental psychology, truly. I think it is more of a white male story. I say that with no condescension or anything. It's just that people who are more comfortable in dominant society have less inner struggle to push against the general narratives, the dominant narratives. I talk about in my book an African American writer named Richard Wright, who I adore, and a lot of the feminist movement, and others. And I think your example of Dr. King is tremendous. When people are more under the thumb of society or more under the thumb of their parents' expectations, whether for gender or career or any number of, also for gay people, that struggle to say yes to your parents for 55 years is life-threatening. It's much, much harder. And so it's easier then for certain people to adhere to these rules and expectations until their father passes away, as you expressed for Irving Yalom. I like him a great deal as a thinker, right? But I think it's an interesting point. And so it then also suggests how much of our life we're participating in dominant cultural narratives versus working to upset them. And your example again of Dr. King, I think, is very profound in terms of course, what he was able to do in his quite short lifetime, his tragically short lifetime, because he was saying no to the dominant cultural expectations of oppression. And he was saying no to his father's fear for him that if he continued to listen to his father's fear, he wasn't going to do his life's work. And what a perfect example to your first question of the importance of this for society too. These are tremendously generative years. What if we use them upholding a broken culture versus taking it down and transforming it? It's not just about taking it down. It's making something better.
For sure, for sure. Now, we're talking here more about psychological separation than physical separation. And is it possible, do you think, to maintain a good relationship as this process is happening? Or do you recommend that individuals quite literally create boundaries here and break contact while this is going on?
No, I mean, it's absolutely different for every person, and not just every family, but every parent, every relationship, maybe siblings. It can also be, happen with a church or close friend group. Ideally, it's all done in relationship, actually. That's not always possible because it becomes, it is a two-way street. There has to be full participation. But ideally, parents are able to hear their children say, I need you to see me differently. This isn't who you think I am. Or that really hurt when you express that because I'm really struggling to figure out who I am and I could use your support. Any number of things. I talk in my book a little bit, and I recommend this for clients. Sometimes it involves letter writing instead of direct face-to-face conversation when we need to get things out and express things that can't easily be expressed face-to-face. But it absolutely may involve physical separation. It may absolutely involve very strong boundaries, especially from toxic and abusive behavior. I don't think everyone needs to be able to figure this out in relationship, but by no means do I advocate cutting people out of your life when the potential for transforming those relationships is there.
How was this experience for you in your life?
Well, it was very messy. I mean, it was a step-by-step process, and it went on for years and years. I can say I am extremely grateful to have close relationships with my mother and my father and my stepmother now. I'm extremely grateful. But that was years and years and years of negotiation, of conversation, of boundaries, of crying, of trying again and trying again. And it was different again for each one of those people with me. And it took a lot of effort, I think, on all of our parts. And I dedicated my book to them, to all three of them, largely because I think that they both model living lives that they enjoy as individuals, which has been critical for me to see adults, the closest adults in my life, actually pursuing themselves versus staying frozen somewhere. But they also each individually remained open to sorting out our relationships. And that was tremendously important to me. So, all sorts of difficult conversations, all sorts of trying again. It was a long process.
I can imagine. So the like one of the central ideas in your book, Satya, is this navigation between stability and meaning, and these two different types of people, meaning types and stability types. Can you maybe tell us about this and also the fireplace metaphor that you use as well?
Sure, sure. So yes, so I talk in my book about there being a spectrum of quarter lifers. I want to emphasize it's a spectrum, because I don't believe in strict binaries. And in fact, the whole point of this is trying to find a sense of wholeness and unity between these poles. But the two poles are stability and meaning. And what I argue is that quarter lifers tend to begin adulthood more adhered to one of these poles than the other. And so I talk about quarter lifers who are stability types and really adhered to often more of the dominant cultural expectations of checking boxes, of having a retirement account by a certain age and getting married by a certain age and starting a family. There's a sense of a roadmap that's more or less clear. I mean, nothing about quarter life is very clear today, but that there's some sense of those are the things I need to do and I'm going to go after them. And meaning types on the other side are people for whom that checklist is both impossible to conceive, but also kind of an allergen. They can't imagine wanting to plan a career by a certain age or buy a house by a certain age, that everything just feels messy and they're just trying to satisfy their soul and not be depressed or not be anxious and, be able to live in this world. So they often present quite differently. At the end of the day, both of these types are seeking, ironically, what the other one has ultimately. And this then becomes shadow work, as it's more popularly known these days. It's understanding what is on the opposite side of your set of values, and yet something that ultimately you're going to need to go in search of. So that stability types will at some point, and it's happening typically earlier and earlier, say, oh my gosh, I have checked these boxes, but my life is quite empty. And meaning types will say, I am trying so hard to pursue what I love, but I can't do it without being able to pay rent and feed myself. And I need more safety. I need more structure. So the fireplace metaphor then is an image I use in which I talk about stability types being a beautiful, well-built, well-constructed fireplace without fire inside. There's no meaning, there's no warmth, and there's no nature. There's nothing wild inside of them. They have to go in search of nature and warmth and wildness. And meaning types alternately can often have quite a bit of wildness and nature and warmth and, passion and curiosity, but there's nothing to contain it. There's nothing to keep them safe and structured. And so ultimately, the goal is to have both a well-built, functional fireplace and a warm, beautifully burning fire inside.
That's such a good metaphor. Now, if I was to come to you and you recognized that I was heavily indexed on the meaning side of things and kind of out of balance in that area, how might you go about helping me to seek out sources of stability in my life?
It's often very meticulous work of really honoring that things aren't working the way that they need to be for that person. And that doesn't mean saying things like you need to join the real world and you need to get it together, because those are admonitions that are sort of coming from dominant culture to meaning types to say figure it out. And meaning types are going to resist typically a little bit the way that I hear you having done with your father, that we tend to kind of resist the admonitions because it feels like the values we're trying to avoid are just trying to yank us into something. So I really try to align with the values of meaning types and say, I hear you. The world is a mess. You have something deeply burning inside of you that wants to be lived in this lifetime. You should have those things. I agree. And I really do. This isn't me, lying to them, right? I really do. I believe that. And I do think that it makes the world a better place when we are actually connected with our souls. But, you are a wildfire burning without containment. We need to figure out how to find containment. That's just sort of a relational thing then to say this isn't working for you. I hear you. You want to do this thing. You want to be a novelist or whatever the piece may be. But in order to get there, you need to be able to survive. You need to survive for the next 5 years. So how are we going to negotiate you gaining the skills and gaining enough interest to participate in society so that you can be a novelist if that's what you're working towards? And that involves a lot of negotiation, but I need to stay on their side throughout.
For sure. I'm reminded of two things here. So there's a writer called Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote a book called Eat, Pray, Love, and then Big Magic as well. But
No, I know her well.
very early on in her career, she made a promise to herself, or a promise to her muse, or her inspiration for her writing, and it was essentially that she would never depend on it to support her. It could always depend on her to support the writing and the creativity. So that basically meant that she would take jobs as a waitress or whatever she had to do to fund her creative habit, she would do, and I think this is sort of kind of what we're getting at.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think Elizabeth Gilbert is extremely wise. And I actually think, despite her being one of the more famous authors of the last decades, she really still doesn't get the credit quite that she deserves. And so I appreciate you bringing her in, because I do think that what she models is a very radical devotion to the creative self. And, I speak about this more in psychological terms as the soul, or meaning, but it is very deeply rooted to creativity too, of what each of us individually is seeking to create in our lifetime. And that might be in very small ways. It might be in large ways. It might involve creating children and raising children. It might involve starting a business or making art or cooking or gardening or tending to animals. There's so many ways that shows up. But I think what you just expressed is modeling, really reversing the expectations that we were all raised with. Most of us were raised with, which is to say the stability must serve the meaning, not that the meaning waits and waits and waits, like a neglected animal or a neglected human at the feet of stability while stability does its thing for decades and decades. That serves nobody. And it really puts us all in a prison that feels incredibly painful to be in. And again, we kind of then end up just reinforcing that prison for each other instead of this radical notion that, yes, we have to survive. We have to participate in these systems in some way. I'm not suggesting we don't. And for some people, that's much harder. But to what ends? It needs to have something at the end that is actually the point of us all being here.
I've heard you say that you don't like the question, what's the point of this?
Yeah.
But
that's it. That's in context, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. With your own with your own situation, where would you sit along that spectrum between stability and meaning, and how did you reconcile that difference within yourself?
Well, let me just to the thing that you just said a moment ago. I just want to clarify that what I really that word or that phrase rather, what's the point, is something I hear myself say. I hear clients say it. It often, when somebody is asking themselves or announcing out loud, but what's the point? It's usually a huge green flag to say whatever you're negating by saying what's the point, you should be doing that thing. Because if your ego is putting up that specific protest, it usually is sort of a last-ditch undermining effort to get you to ignore the thing you actually should be paying attention to. Well, what's the point? What's the point? Why would I bother? It's actually a deep longing kind of shrouded in dismissal. So does that make sense?
So it's almost like it's a form of self-protection. You're sort of saying, it's frivolous. Like it doesn't really mean anything. There's no future in that. So
nobody's going to care, But underneath it, if you peel back a couple of layers, maybe even one, it's typically with what's the point as a defense mechanism. It's not buried very deep. There's a whole notion down there. And you have to peel that back, sometimes for friends, sometimes for yourself, and say, why would you say, what's the point? Tell me what's going on down there. Like, how much do you want that thing? It's usually pretty profound.
For sure. So yeah, I asked about how you navigate or where you sit along the spectrum and how you've been able to reconcile any differences in your own sort of battle here.
Yeah. My experience in earlier quarter life was that I was a very high functioning meaning type, which is to say that I understood how to play the game pretty well. I did school, I was good at school. I enjoyed my classes, I was capable of getting jobs and paying rent. But I was in a chronic existential crisis that drove me to the brink and drove everyone around me to the brink. I couldn't make sense of anything, right? So I was, people talk in addiction circles about having a low or a high bottom. Which is to say, like, my threshold for doing jobs I couldn't stand was not very deep. I couldn't tolerate being at jobs I couldn't stand for very long. I would quit or get fired. And so I really had to figure this out in order to survive, and so I write in my book about one specific crisis I had when I was working at a tech firm and had this sort of unlikely job as a project manager. And there'd been all these layoffs and to my experience, all of the most loathsome people had been retained by the CEO, and all of these great human beings who I'd enjoyed working with had been fired. And I just thought, what am I doing here? Oh my God, what am I participating in? And I was being paid extremely well for a 23-year-old, and I was absolutely miserable. And so that really became a significant reckoning point for me that my soul could not tolerate being silenced for very long. And often with stability types, part of what they're extraordinarily good at is silencing their soul. And that then the work then is to carefully tease apart why they feel that that's what they're supposed to be doing, and with so much effort. But I could not keep my soul quiet. And thank goodness, frankly. I mean, I'm glad she's so strong, because I'm much happier now than I would have been. But that's what, I was really forced to my knees to listen and to pay attention. And from there, it was a step-by-step process to do that, and to trust, to take a lot of risks and trust.
I think what you're talking about requires a lot of courage, it really does. And, something that came to mind for me here as you were speaking was that, these situations can cause a lot of emotional discomfort, and it can be tempting in times like this, especially if it's a really rough time, to take, medication or maybe an antidepressant or whatever. And to me, it seems like that has potentially could have potential long-term negative consequences, because you're numbing something like an instinctual force within you that knows that there's a better path for you or whatever, but you're numbing it with with medication or whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can actually go either way. I think it can go either way. And so it's important that it be an individual conversation, with an individual provider who really sees the person and sees the longings in front of them. But I also think part of what I hear you speaking to is drawing into question more of the medical model of psychology. Psychology really used to be a humanities in a very deep way. It was founded primarily by physicians, but it had an enormous amount of humanities involved, often to the detriment, because people were not getting scientifically grounded treatments at all. But things have really gone in the direction of insurance companies and medicine in a way that also is quite harmful for a lot of patients. So we have to balance it. But somewhat like everything else I'm saying, right? Stability and meaning. I think we need to bring both the humanities and the sciences to treatment. And for part of that, the sciences currently is pharmaceuticals. I am absolutely not against pharmaceuticals, but I think they need to be managed correctly. So some of my patients, the only thing that made a difference was the right antidepressant or the right anti-anxiety, and that then they were able to put into place and put into practice everything else we were working on, or they could tackle their trauma for the first time. For other people, it has meant really carefully getting them off of medication they were put on far too early, or sort of trying to support them to get the courage to tackle something that was more of a life, structural issue than it was something just internally in terms of chronic depression. They can really act like each other a lot of the time. So it's important to have a very individual relationship. Again, it's difficult when a lot of prescribers are only seeing their patients 15 minutes every few months, or even an hour, every few months, which is rare, extremely rare anymore, So I try to take as much of a holistic approach as possible.
That's very wise. Are you familiar with the work of James Hillman and his book, The Soul's Code?
Oh, of course. Yeah. James Hillman was, I met him a few times, and he was very, in very small ways, but he had a great impact on my career early on. The Soul's Code is, James Hillman is part of this world, right? He was a Jungian. I mean, he kind of created his own branch within Jungian psychology. But this is very much, everything I'm speaking to is a lot of a similar ethos of really just trusting that your soul has a path that it is trying to find. And we have to trust that.
And do you believe in this idea of the daimon, where there's essentially a guiding force that's with each person that sort of knows what's best for them, in the same way that, within every acorn, the every acorn sort of contains an oak tree. The same with us, like there's like a big potential there, but we don't listen to that voice. What do you think about that?
I think it's true. I think he's using more mythic language by calling it a daemon. And but that really what he's also speaking to is the soul, or the anima, or we could talk about this in different ways within the field. But I do think there is a timeless part of ourselves, a more ancient part of ourselves that is not adhering to the rules of time and space and society and capitalism and all these things, and actually does have a much larger sense of the course of our lives. It can be hard to uncover that voice. It's not there every millisecond of the day. We have to develop a relationship with it. But this is a core idea of Jung's that Hillman, was very engaged with. But there's also this notion of the inner marriage, and that ultimately we're in relationship with ourselves, and not just in this passive way of like, oh yeah, I like myself, or I respect myself, all those things are good, but that there's actually a quite deep attempt to unify the opposites internally, and to find a relationship between the timeless self and the time-bound self, between the ego and the soul, right? Or the big self with a capital S, and between the feminine and the masculine. Those are heteronormative ideas, but there's a sense of tension still between these values. And so, when Hillman is speaking about the daimon, he's doing what Elizabeth Gilbert expressed. I think Elizabeth Gilbert has been very influenced, by the way, by Jungian psychology and by Joseph Campbell. It's my sense, that it's the same thing. It's to say, I will serve you, my God. I will serve you, my creativity. I will serve you, my beloved. I am not going to expect you to serve me. My work is to serve you. And that requires trust. It requires love. It requires courage, to say, I will serve you and not these expectations for us. And we know with a happy, truly, truly happy marriage, we see so few versions of it, unfortunately, but a truly, beloved relationship, life is better when we turn our attention in that direction instead of towards expectations and the prisons of all these systems, right? And so it serves all of us when we serve that. Again, this is more of Hillman's language, but you see it all throughout mythology and other parts of psychology of serving the daimon internally.
Yeah, it's interesting because so there's another guy we've interviewed for this podcast. He's called Bernardo Kastrup, and he's a philosopher on consciousness. And he talks about he has this really strong relationship with he calls it a daimon as well. He raised a lot of young, and he says that he literally has to negotiate with it because like he views it as almost like an impersonal force. It's sort of like nature wanting to express itself through Bernardo. And he says like he literally has to negotiate with it, saying like, look, yes, I will do your will, but I have to also pay the bills. I have to make sure that I'm looking after myself. So it's sort of a bit like what you're saying about navigating stability and meaning too. Something I really would love to cover before we wrap up, Satya, would be there's an exercise I've heard you speak about that is super powerful. It's the two stick figures and how this can help people find their direction. Can you tell us about this exercise?
Sure. Yes, I'll do my best to keep it brief because in practice, of course, with a real person, it's always very nuanced and specific. But the idea really here is and we can use all these different words we've been using today, is on one sheet of paper, it's very simple, right? I encourage people to draw two stick figures that don't have any specifics to them yet. So one on the left side and one on the right side. And we would, if we're going to take this example of Bernard just for a moment, right? On one side, we would write, this is the key here, is I want to kind of emphasize, if we can imagine the side of him that is entirely devoted to paying the bills and to structure and to the external world, and to expectations, to create a persona, to create a character, a person. And it's not just, what does this part of me want? It's like, who is this being? Right? So this is where the relationship between the ego and the soul comes in, or, between Bernard and his daimon. But it's to say, here is this person, and then over here, create a whole version of the daimon. Make them two separate people. Give them names. What are their jobs? What are their values? What kind of romantic relationships do they like? Does one want monogamy and the other wants polyamory? Does one want to be a nun and the other one wants to have 7 children and be married, right? Whatever this looks like. So you're creating entire humans, really whole characters in a novel, and giving them color and really even clothing. What do they like to do on a Sunday, right? So we try to take time to kind of flesh this out as much as possible. And then what we're curious about this, so that's the sort of first steps, to give them names and to really get a sense of them as characters. Again, characters in a movie, characters in a book, right? Then we ask, right now, in this moment, how much of these 2 people are operating in your own existence, right? So it might be, one is operating at 90% and the other is operating at 10%. Okay. So it may be, let's say 20 years ago with Bernard, I have no idea, of course, right? But that before he negotiated this and figured this out for himself, that the Bernard self, right, the stability structural self, was operating at 90%, and this Daimon self was quite suppressed and quieted down and locked away somewhere and was operating at 10%. You're looking for currently, and people tend to have an immediate understanding of this inside themselves and an immediate ability to sort of do the math, so to speak, and to say that's where they are, the percentages. The next question is, what is the ideal for them? What's the ideal? And the ideal, believe it or not, is not always 50-50. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen somebody respond 50-50. It may, in fact, be a little bit probably more to Elizabeth Gilbert's point, that in fact, the Daimon self needs to be reversed. The Daimon self needs to live primarily and be the dominant. And the structural self needs to support that. With that, life still needs space, but much less and in much more of a negotiated way. Sometimes it's more 60-40, but people have a sense of, with these 2 characters inside of themselves, what needs to still be negotiated. And so it can create both an accessible exercise, but the other piece of it is, once we've given them names and once we have a sense of that, it becomes a tool in therapy for me to then also be able to say, what happened to so-and-so? Where are they at these days? Because you can see how the negotiations kind of can go in waves. And it's an important tool to be able to remind people in a very tangible way of what it is that they're often suppressing or avoiding.
That's a powerful exercise. I'm actually going to try that quite soon. Because I think it's, I think these different parts of ourselves can get out of balance so easily,
Yeah. And that's it. It's not just a one-time thing. It's a constant. I think, again, your examples have expressed, it is a relationship. It's a constant process. I don't so much think of it as a negotiation. I think Bernard put it in slightly different words than I personally would. I think of it as a relationship. And in truly intimate relationship, there is a process of sort of who's getting their needs met on any given day or in any given time more. And sometimes that is a process, but hopefully it's one that's really about love as much as possible and about mutual respect.
Interesting. Okay. A couple of questions to finish up. Advice for anybody that feels, so this is a developmental stage, and an individual might look around and see that all of their peers, all of their friends are maybe doing different things, and they look at them and they think, oh, I should be doing that too. Let's say, for example, someone in their early 30s and all of their peers are like having families and kids and everything. What would you say to someone like that sort of feels like they're being left behind?
Well, I think when we are comparing ourselves to other people, there's one of 2 things is probably happening. One, we feel we're supposed to be doing something and that we're not quite normal and there's something wrong with us, or we're falling behind, or we're failing in some way, much like we spoke about earlier in our conversation. And I really try to encourage people not to compare themselves or their lives with others, because really what we're doing, again, when we're doing that, is adhering to the dominant script. so that the dominant script becomes the thing we're supposed to be doing and not our own individual lives. That's always a problem because it will always get us trapped in something we don't want to be in. There is another possibility, which is that when we look at other people's lives or we have some sense of longing, I wish I was there, there may be something in that is actually information for our souls and our path in terms of our seeing our own longing played out somewhere. So it may be that there is a deep desire for someone to have children and it's not something they'd emphasized. That's kind of a different thing. It's more than of saying, I need to find my way back to this. I need to sort this out. Envy can both be its own prison, but it can also sometimes be an indication of where we wish we were and sort of our own soul speaking back to us through projection and through what we're seeing externally, right? So I try, as always, to differentiate those things with people and also to really honor that time is relative. Einstein was very clear about that. And life and time are very relative, that when we align with our deepest self, time becomes irrelevant. It's just once you could do it in your 80s and think, thank God I got here, and not have any concern. I always advocate doing it earlier, but the main thing is that you get on track to find your own self and not just in this kind of spiritual, meaningful, dissociated way, but truly on the earth, how to combine stability and meaning in your own existence. The level of satisfaction that's possible is remarkable.
Amazing. Okay. Final question. I was speaking to a few people earlier about this interview and kind of the things that I'm thinking or the kind of takeaways that I've got from researching a bit about your work. And for me, when I think about it, it's really struck me that this is so important for us as a society to really take seriously, because we're essentially this period of life is when you're making the decisions that are going to inform your journey for sorry, there's a police car in the background. But the decisions you make during this period are going to shape not only your trajectory, but collectively they're shaping everybody's trajectory. So if we invested resources in this area, it would have a really positive effect on the world that we live in, because more people will be doing things that just contribute to a more kind of flourishing society. So I was wondering, have you thought much about what could be done structurally or systemically? What societal support structures could we put in place to really, have some kind of ritual for the quarter life, some kind of rite of passage or whatever? What would you do if you were advising policymakers, for example?
Oh, it's a great question to end on. I have so many thoughts, honestly. There's several other books that I've thought about in this vein, and it feels like an uphill battle, truthfully, because there's on some level, first of all, so much disdain for this time of life, and politics worldwide is such a mess. It feels like, God, what's the point? Well, there I am, right? You hear that? Because it is so important. It feels so important, right? There are so many things I would do. One thing that I've been really curious about is seeing how this stage of life is treated all over the world and what different policies are providing what to people in this stage of life. So I just read an article about how happy the quarter lifers are in Lithuania, which I thought was fascinating, that apparently they are getting a great deal of support, and standard of living is quite low. Standard of living is high, but cost of living is low. And it's a whole piece about how happy the 20-somethings and 30-somethings are in Lithuania, right? I've learned that in Botswana, I need to fact check this, but this is my understanding. In Botswana, when you turn 18, the government gives you a piece of land that is yours to own. In different parts of the world, this stage of life is treated with policies in different ways. And it's typically, you can see when it's treated with respect versus, in the States, it's absolutely abysmal. You turn 18, which only means that you can buy firearms and you can be treated as an adult for criminal trials. And you can vote. I should add that in. But the sense of becoming an adult is sort of loaded with actually danger and fear and militarism, and it's not welcoming. It's not joyful. It's not supportive by any means. And so I am really curious to research how this is treated worldwide. And to see, not just to come up with sort of what should we be doing, but to really understand how has this been treated in the last 20 years worldwide. But also, I think, to this question of ritual and more of the spiritual approach, what was happening when we had cultures that were more related to nature, for young people to enter adulthood with some sense of connection to their communities and connection to the earth and connection to their purpose and their souls and their gods, right? That was happening very differently. And there were, of course, there were rituals, there were rites of initiation, and we could be learning from all of those things, past and present. With the right team. For me, it feels like a big task to take on by myself, so I get overwhelmed. But it's a wonderful question because we really don't have proper answers yet. Not in a dominant culture way, right?
For sure, for sure. Well, Satya, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Where would you recommend people to go after this conversation to learn more about your book, your work, and anything else?
Well, my website is satyabyock.com. And my book is quite prominent currently on my website. My book is called Quarterlife, The Search for Self in Early Adulthood. And hopefully you can find it in your bookstore, wherever you may be, certainly online. And I also write a pretty regular newsletter on Substack. My Substack is called Self and Society. And it's my full name, .substack.com. And so people can sign up for that. I also teach classes online and do lots of stuff. So I'd love to engage with your listeners in any way.
Amazing. Thank you, Satya.
Thank you. What a pleasure. It was beautiful to talk to you. Thank you.